What struck me the first day that I met Tom Wilson, aside from just really the sheer beauty of him, was that this essence of him was so alive. When you look at a Tom Wilson painting, you want to go there. Wow, I want to be right in the middle of that place. Or, wow, what was that guy thinking? Tom tuned in on what you found value in as art. What bled through immediately that you read was this person was so alive. He was just so alive.
When I met Tom, and Tom came into the restaurant circle here, he really did not talk much about his modeling career, and it was years before he ever showed any of us his portfolios and from that time. So, I didn't know Tom at the time he was a model. By the time he came back to Sussex County, that modeling career was over. He had studio in Paris. He traveled all over Europe. He also had a lot of close friends in New York City. And on one of his trips to New York, he was invited to, it was an Andy Warhol party. So of course, the whole art crowd in New York was there, including a lot of photographers. And I believe it was Scavallo met Tom and was, like most people, taken by the man's beauty. I mean, he was just a beautiful person. And some pictures were taken, they were shown to other people. All of a sudden, modeling agents were at his door. And when he went back to Europe, he landed a job with one of the big agencies and became a hugely successful fashion model. Traveled all over the world. He was sent on shoots to Africa, the Middle East, the Caribbean. I mean, there's pictures of Tom's modeling career all over the world. And he was being paid fabulous sums of money to do this. So he did that, I think, for probably at least 2 years, maybe 3 years. And he told me that he was just doing this till he had enough money to come back to the United States, move back to Lewis, have an art studio, and have enough money to spend time becoming the artist he'd always wanted to be, which is pretty much how that whole thing played out. When he came back here, that was it for his modeling days. He never looked back. He just gave it up. He said it was just not the life he had ever envisioned for himself.
You've heard me refer to that house as the house that love built. It was. I learned love in that house. And it was a privilege to be there. The doorbell rang. I went to the door, and there was this stunning figure at the door wearing overalls and no shirt with a camera around his neck. I mean, it was like Adonis standing at the door. And I opened the door, and he said, "Hi, is Peggy here?" And I went, "Oh my, thank you, God. I don't know who you are, but..." I was not, I wasn't present when they met. It wasn't that long after it, but I can tell you there was slower, lower Delaware, still very conservative. The exploding, blossoming gay community that was here, I can tell you was met with a lot of hostility on some people's parts. So there was an edginess, for you to be out in this community was bold.
The gay community here was finally coming out and being a known presence. Before that, it's a very closeted scene here for gay men and women. But by the 80s, that had all begun to change. And from that, it sort of blossomed into a relationship with my business partner, Leo Medish, who was the chef here. Tom was very interested in who was creating all this wonderful cuisine, so he was introduced to Leo, and that was it. Once they met, I think it was kind of love at first sight. It was like they were made for one another, and once they met, that was kind of it. They were a couple, and they were a couple until Tom passed away.
So Tom and Leo's circle of friends grew along those lines. But of course, people that were just great fans of the back porch, that loved Leo as a chef and loved Tom as an artist, those people were finally able to put the label of gay second beyond who they were as men. Those two men taught me what dignity between two people in love should be. They taught me about the healthy differences you need to maintain in a relationship to be who you are, but how to respect each other. I learned love in that house. And it was a privilege to be there.
Artists give themselves permission to be more gregarious, more open, more quirky, more welcoming, more expressive. But Tom was all of those things. Tom was really the first person that I knew pretty well whose work I really admired because of his use of light, and sometimes there would be a kind of a diffused light going on throughout a painting that he would manipulate, and I liked that a lot. His pastels were vibrant. In fact, at some point, I was asking him about putting a fixing agent on his pastels, and Tom said, no, that makes them dull.
This is a permanent display piece owned by my bartender, B. Neild. It's one of Tom Wilson's pastels. It's been hanging up there for probably 10 years, and I think my bartender could have sold it about 100 times. He was already an established artist. He'd had studios in Europe. At the time, he was being represented, I think, by a gallery in Washington, D.C. He had already begun to make a reputation locally. And one thing led to another, and I finally put him on staff as our art director. He knew all the local artists, and we started showing a lot of different types of artists and art here. So it was a pretty exciting time.
One of the great lessons I learned from Tom was how many layers and levels there are to how art coalesces, and how many artistic things are one and the same, no matter how different they are, because they are art. You know, it was not uncommon that if he was painting one of his old cars, if he was painting the black drum majorette, she's exciting. That figure in her sparkly outfit is exciting and larger than life. And, you know, if Tom was laying something like that down on a canvas, you would come in and, you know, Dakota Staten would be playing, or the Sweet Inspirations would be wailing in the background. There would be music that was indicative of what I think what was trying to come out of his fingertips.
The dot paintings were totally dots, different colors, different patterns, more of an abstraction. And eventually, the more representational stuff took over and the dots disappeared. So these paintings he did for commissions where he got a lot of money were very tedious. They were sometimes of people that he was not particularly interested in them or what he was painting, but it was good money, had to make a living. And so he would labor on these things. They were very labor intensive. But he had more work than he could actually produce sometimes. He had a backlog of people waiting for him to do commissions. He did not have enough time to do the subject matter he liked. And he lived on Lewis Beach in a house that had a beautiful garden with flowers. He loved the garden. And I think one day he just had it, he took some paper out in the garden and an easel and some pastels and just started going crazy. And just this burst of color and energy. And then as his health declined, I think he liked doing the pastels because he could produce those more quickly and they were sellable, so he could make a good living by doing that.
It was too tiring for him. And so he started doing pastels. He started, he went into a different version of the pastels. But what is very clear in all of those paintings, if you look at them, they're paths. Every one of them has a path in it. He knew he was going somewhere.
You know, because he had his oils and or his dots and the pastel, the flowers, and he had so many different stages and someone you would, read about.
Why did Tom go through all of those phases? I think probably most likely because he had something to prove to himself about who he was. And all of those phases were expressions of who he was. And his own validation of them by the creation of this incredible, beautiful art.
He saw art in everything. And it didn't have to be visual art as that was. Tom's life was art.
Yeah.
And the world went on with itself. And you wanted to say, stop, don't you know what's not here? And you can't make the rest of the world stop.
I don't know, I still remember the day when Leo told me and about Tom's diagnosis, and it was just as if everything just stopped. And no one really understood what was going on anyway about the disease, about AIDS and HIV, and it was all just very cloudy. We just didn't know what was going on, and we just couldn't understand it. And I just remember sitting there in the front room at the back porch. We were working, and we went out there, and he told me, and I didn't even know what to say. I didn't know how to react. I didn't know what to think. The whole back porch community, the town, everyone that knew Tom and Leo just came together to try and figure out how we could best get through this,
That whole time frame, we were losing people right and left to AIDS. It was a very painful and a very scary time and a very sad time. In a almost 5-year period, I attended 30 funerals of friends. Tom was one of the first people that I knew to be diagnosed with HIV, and Tom always believed it would take him. Leo always believed he would survive it. There was a big difference there, and Tom always believed it would take him. So there was a sort of darkness that surrounded him with that.
It was the first person I ever knew that was HIV positive.
Yeah.
And that actually came really the developed disease.
Yeah.
And that took over and from which he eventually died. And the first person I knew. And And that brought it home. That here's something that the country, the world is facing now, but this wasn't the country, this wasn't the world, this was our friend.
There came a point where he became so ill he couldn't paint, he couldn't use pastels, and some of the last things he did, which we actually have, are colored pencil drawings that are small because he was only able to hold a pencil and a pad. And it really, as his vision decreased, which would be a horrible thing for an artist, you could see in his paintings the darkness, and that's what he was seeing.
You know, I'd go to work all day and I would come in and do basically the night shift. And we were all sort of in that rotation for what was almost 3 weeks in taking care of him in that final round. But I came in from work one day and Leo was in the bedroom with Tom, and it was a moment nobody was supposed to see. And I stepped in and I looked into what was the music room, the red room, and no one was in there. And then I looked into their bedroom, and you know, Tom was laying in the hospital bed and Leo was in a chair next to the bed, but he was holding Tom's hand, stroking it with his other hand, and he was laying with his head against the bed with it resting on Tom's chest. And I was so happy I got to see that moment. And the world went on with itself. And you wanted to say, stop, don't you know what's not here? And you can't make the rest of the world stop. That summer was just an absolute blur. And it was just like Tom Wilson to leave us on Memorial Day weekend. You know, it couldn't, it had to be a lot of pomp and circumstance and a time that you would never forget, you know. It was a hard summer. They had this relationship that was a covenant magnificently kept. And it was a love that never left. All those years later, Leo would say, I don't want to be alone. I don't want to be alone, but when you have the love that I've had, everything else pales by comparison.
Hello, if you'd like to leave a message here at the studio, wait for the beep. I'm not going to be in a lot this weekend. I have house guests, and if you'll tell me when you're coming, tell the machine, I'll try to be here. Thanks.